It's 1885. Canada's hunger for land has provoked a Métis revolt, led by a zealous revolutionary and a legendary hunter. It's frontier spirit versus industrial might in the battle that made the West.
Conquer, surrender, victory, defeat. These deadly battles shaped continents. These are nations at war.
It's 1885, and after less than 20 years in existence, the Dominion of Canada is a nation on the rise. A vital part of the British Empire, Canada was in the middle of a rapid course of expansion. Its population swelled with waves of immigrants from the British Isles, Europe, and beyond. Many of the newcomers headed westward, looking for a better life in the prairies.
You're told by a Canadian agent, we have all this land and freedom, practice their religion, speak your language, just become good Canadians.
When created in 1867, Canada covered only 4 of the eastern colonies in British North America. By 1870, however, the Dominion's territory tripled in size when it purchased the territories of the Hudson's Bay Company.
The fur trade really was the economy of northern North America into the early 19th century, into the early 1800s, at which point the timber trade pushed it aside as the most lucrative economic engine, economic force in northern North America. Northern meaning the future Canada.
There was just one major problem. No one had told the native population their homeland was for sale. Aboriginal nations like the Blackfoot Confederacy, Assiniboine, and Plains Cree had called the West home for generations. Merchants had relied on their knowledge and skills to supply pelts and pemmican. From this contact and cooperation, an entirely new people emerged, the Métis. The descendants of French, Scottish, or English fathers and Aboriginal mothers. Symbolized by the infinity flag, their society was a fusion of both worlds. They hunted buffalo for food and trade, but they also farmed the land.
Missionaries, when they did begin to move into the areas where the Hudson's Bay Company traders were going about their commercial activities, often disapproved of fur traders' marriages with indigenous women, of fur traders' mixed heritage families. So if missionaries were an advanced guard of settlement, they came into clashes with fur traders who were the sort of advanced guard of colonization.
In 1869, the purchase of the HBC's territory threatened Métis title to their land. The appointment of the openly anti-French William McDougall as chief surveyor and lieutenant governor of the new territories worsened Métis fears.
The Métis were seen in the same light as the First Nations. The dominant Anglo-Canadian society and the dominant Anglo-Canadian culture was interested in getting them out of the way to begin the process of settling and developing a larger Anglo-Canadian state.
The First Nations people regarded us as white, and a lot of them were told that we were sent by the white man to steal their things. The white people identified us as First Nations. And so unfortunately we suffered discrimination from both sides at times.
To protect their homes, culture, and religion, the Métis decided to take action. Before the formal handover from the company to the Canadian government was official, a group of prominent Métis organized into a council to negotiate with Ottawa directly. Emerging as the spokesman of the council was a passionate young man, recently returned from Montreal. His name? Louis Riel. The 24-year-old son of the Red River settlement was passionate, well-spoken, and educated. Originally destined for the priesthood, Riel's time studying in Montreal was cut short by a doomed romance. His engagement to a French Canadian was ended by her parents' objections about his native blood. Though he left the church behind, he never lost his faith. Now Riel was back home, convinced of his people's special destiny. Knowing the Canadian government representative, William McDougall, would have little sympathy for them, the Métis moved to strengthen their position. They mustered a volunteer militia to chase off the survey parties and block McDougall's arrival in the territory at gunpoint. With the militia the only significant military force in the territory, Riel and Council launched a daring attack in the hopes of forcing Ottawa's hand. On November 2nd, 1869, Riel and over 100 Métis militia moved against the administrative center of the territory, Fort Garry. From the former HBC headquarters, Riel and the Council declared a provisional government of Manitoba and presented Ottawa with a list of demands. But Riel would make a fatal mistake. When an armed posse of pro-Canadian locals attempted to retake the fort, they were quickly captured. Among them was the defiant Irish Protestant settler Thomas Scott.
Thomas Scott was a troublemaker in the truest sense. He was an instigator. He was a very, very violent man. Scott refused to capitulate, to compromise. In fact, there's an anecdote that says he spat in Riel's face.
On March 4th, 1870, with Riel's sanction, Scott was drugged before a firing squad and shot. It was a warning to other troublesome locals not to follow Scott's example, and to Ottawa that the Métis were not to be trifled with. Ottawa was in a no-win situation. Without forces to challenge the Métis, the Canadian government was forced to agree to its demands in the form of the Manitoba Act. The Red River Colony entered Confederation as the Province of Manitoba. The Métis were promised their land, language, and faith would be respected. But the man who had led the Métis to their greatest victory would not escape the government's wrath.
Unfortunately for Riel, Scott became a martyr for the English-Canadian community. In Ontario, people railed against Riel. They called him a murderer.
With English Canada baying for his blood over Scott's death, Riel fled across the American border. Even in exile, Riel was hailed as a hero by his people. 15 years later, the Métis would call on him to lead them in their hour of need. It's 1884, and a party of Métis traveled to Montana in search of an exiled revolutionary. Leading the group was Gabriel Dumont. Born in the Red River Colony, Dumont was a skilled hunter and master marksman. He could speak 6 languages, none of which were English.
Dumont was a very effective leader. He was very charismatic and very competent.
A leader amongst his community, he had seen the hardship the Métis faced as the buffalo disappeared.
So the herds were slaughtered in mass. Trainloads of people were taken out to do that and shot them just for amusement.
To Dumont, the survival of the Métis nation was a cause worth fighting for. Since the end of the Red River Rebellion, many Métis left Manitoba behind, pushing west into the district of Saskatchewan to continue their traditional way of life. But the West was changing.
Now the Canadian government shows up in Saskatchewan in the 1880s, and again they say, listen, we need to negotiate some sort of settlement.
The Canadian Pacific Railway had been created as part of the negotiations to bring British Columbia into Confederation. Nearly complete by the beginning of 1885, the CPR was an iron link which tied the prairies to the booming industrial heart of the country. Facing the same threat to their land as they had in Manitoba, The Métis petitioned Ottawa to recognize their claims in Saskatchewan. With their protests ignored, the Métis turned to a spokesman Ottawa was not likely to ignore. By the fall of 1884, Louis Riel was back in Canada. He rallied support among Anglophones, Métis, and First Nations.
After a year of writing letters, the Canadian government agreed to carry out a census, which meant a head count on the Métis after a year of negotiation. And so that's when Dumont and the rest gave up and said, well, we're going to fight.
On March 18, 1885, he declared the creation of the Provisional Government of Saskatchewan at Batoche, backed up by a 300-strong militia commanded by Dumont.
These people were not necessarily trained as soldiers. They were trained as hunters. So they were also trained in concealment. Their tactics of fighting were more along the lines of what we would call guerrilla fighting, which was hit and run.
Unlike in 1870, the Canadians had a standing armed force in the prairies. The Northwest Mounted Police was a paramilitary service charged with enforcing Ottawa's law. This force posed an immediate threat to the Métis position from their base at Fort Carleton. On March 21st, the Métis rebels sent an ultimatum of surrender to the Northwest Mounted Police Superintendent Leif Crozier. When no answer came, the rebels occupied the nearby settlement of Duck Lake. Seeing his chance to end the rebellion in one stroke, Crozier planned to attack the Métis on March 26th with a force of police and volunteers. Outnumbering them 2-1, Dumont's militia was waiting. To stall the police long enough for his men to flank Crozier's forces, Dumont sent a party to meet them.
When Crozier extended his hand to shake hands, Falling Sand, which was a native with them, mistook it for a threatening gesture and made a grab for his rifle. Somebody shot.
The Métis opened fire from concealed positions in the tree line. In the hail of bullets, Crozier lost 12 men. With Dumont injured, Riel stepped in to stop the rout from turning into a massacre.
Louis Riel was a peacemaker. Really, he was a diplomat. He never sought battle. He didn't believe in killing. And when the Métis had pretty well won the battle at Duck Lake, he wanted the killing to stop.
Riel saw victory as a sign that God favored the Métis cause. For Ottawa, the humiliation at Duck Lake called for an immediate and overwhelming response. With only a small standing army, the Canadian government turned to a volunteer militia to crush the rebels. Drawn from around the Dominion, the Northwest Field Force began to mobilize on March 25th. The Canadian troops were armed with the breech-loading Snyder Enfield rifle. With a range of 600 meters in trained hands, it could fire 10 rounds a minute.
It's about 57 caliber, so a little over half an inch diameter lead bullet. Traveling out there at probably 1,500 feet per second. The effect of being hit with a soft lead bullet at that speed is a pretty devastating wound.
The government infantry could rely on support from artillery to pound Métis positions at range, while the revolutionary Gatling gun could unleash 200 rounds a minute.
It was a labor-saving device. One gun would replace a platoon of soldiers.
Facing them were 300 men of the Métis militia. Modeled on the Métis buffalo hunt, the force was divided into highly mobile groups of 10, led by a captain.
Dumont's familiarity with tactics came largely from past experience. He had experience with the First Nations for many years.
As a military leader, he was quite successful. He really understood the strengths of his forces and the weaknesses of the people he was fighting against.
Dumont and his men knew the local terrain and had already turned it to their advantage at Duck Lake. But equipped with a mixed selection of weapons, with no secure source of supplies and ammunition, the Métis couldn't hope to match the government's crushing firepower. Where the Canadians could rely on modern manufacturing to supply their arsenal, the Métis resorted to hand-making bullets. Where Dumont could rely only on partial support for the locals, Canadian troops under General Frederick Middleton arrived in the war zone by April 6th.
They had 5,000 support and 3,000 troops, all highly trained and with more modern weapons.
Realizing his hopeless situation, Dumont lobbied the provisional government to commit to a guerrilla campaign. A politician, not a general, Riel refused. He believed he could negotiate a settlement with Ottawa. But Middleton was already marching straight for Batoche. Dumont once again pleaded for action. At Fish Creek, he would get his wish. April 24th, 1885. Middleton and nearly 1,000 Canadian militia are marching on the rebel stronghold of Batoche. Middleton's route would take his forces through a gully near Fish Creek, where Gabriel Dumont and 200 militia unleashed a hail of gunfire from protected rifle pits on the high ground. The Canadians were caught in a kill zone. Despite suffering 10 dead and nearly running out of bullets, Dumont's daring trap stunned Middleton. With 10 militia dead and over 40 wounded, the general halted his advance on Batoche for 2 weeks.
Dumont wanted to set up ambushes to harass them, and Riel wouldn't let him do that. And the consequence was the Canadians marched almost all the way to Batoche without any interruption.
As Middleton regrouped, Dumont retreated to prepare for his last stand at Batoche. Dumont had fortified the Métis capital well, with an elaborate series of rifle pits to shelter the outnumbered defenders. But forced to fight a static defense, Dumont had to surrender the only 2 remaining advantages the Métis had: mobility and the ability to use the rugged landscape to their advantage. By May 9th, the Canadians had arrived at Batoche. Middleton had devised a cunning strategy to take the rebel capital in one swift stroke. While his main force assaulted the Métis defenses, a steamboat carrying a group of militia would provide supporting fire, circling around to attack from behind. But poor coordination led to the steamboat launching its attack before Middleton's force had engaged the defenders. Moving quickly, the Métis strung a chain across the river and crippled the vessel by destroying its smokestacks.
It caught the housing of the boat, sheared it off, and knocked out the steering. And then his sharpshooters picked off a bunch of the people on the second deck.
Realizing the attack had begun, Dumont rallied the defenders and pushed the Canadians back with heavy gunfire. The defeat was only a setback. With his artillery and men in position, Middleton spent 2 days shelling Batoche, launching probing attacks against the Métis defenses to find a weak spot. As Dumont fought to the bitter end, Riel retreated into his faith. Now convinced he was divinely chosen to lead his people, Riel wandered the battlefield urging the Métis to fight on in God's name. But prayers and heart were no match for Middleton's artillery. Pounded by Canadian gunners, reduced to firing stones and nails, the Métis defenders could not hold back the onslaught. On May 12th, a Canadian assault swept through the Métis lines and took the town. Riel, Dumont, and the remaining militia fled into the wilderness. Riel was captured 3 days later.
It is believed he surrendered because he thought that the publicity surrounding his surrender would benefit the Métis people.
His trial and execution would divide the country. pitting sympathetic French-Canadian Catholics against vengeful British Protestants. Dumont escaped across the border into Montana. After finding fame and employment in Buffalo Bill Cody's Traveling Wild West show, he was granted amnesty and returned home to Saskatchewan. Despite Métis courage and Dumont's tactical brilliance, the government's capacity to resupply and reinforce in days thanks to the railroad could not be overcome. But Riel and Dumont would have the ultimate victory. Hated in their day for their violent defiance, the rebels' stand for human rights has earned them a place among Canada's greatest heroes. Louis Riel, once considered a dangerous rebel, is now recognized as one of the fathers of the Confederation for his role in shaping the West we know today.